There are truths we spend entire lifetimes trying to bury, secrets so heavy that even when the lips stay closed, the body remembers. I have carried one such truth for more years than I care to count, keeping it hidden behind prayers, behind carefully chosen smiles, and behind the rhythm of convent bells that tell me when to rise and when to sleep. But bells cannot silence the echo of memory, and time cannot erase wounds that were never allowed to heal in the light. I have walked this earth for decades with the weight of silence pressing against my chest. Only now, in the final chapters of my journey, do I feel compelled to release what I have kept bound inside me. My name is Sister Celeste Warren. Today, people see an old nun, a woman of God who has spent her life guiding children, comforting the sick, and kneeling in quiet chapels where candle flames tremble against stone walls. They know me for compassion, for patience, for devotion. But very few know what I endured before I put on this black habit and took my vows. Behind the calm face and the rosary beads lies the story of a child who was not protected, a child who was betrayed in the place that should have been her sanctuary. I do not share this story for pity. I do not share it for scandal. I share it because silence can kill the spirit more completely than violence, because someone listening today may be carrying their own silence, and I want them to know they are not alone. I want them to know that wounds, no matter how deep, do not have the final word. But before we reach that place of hope, we must walk into the shadows where my story began. It began in a home that looked ordinary from the outside, a modest house, with creaking floors, a ticking clock in the hallway, and curtains that swayed gently whenever the summer wind pressed against the windows. To the neighbors, it was the home of a respectable family. To me, it became a prison. I was only a girl then, young enough to still believe that parents were protectors, naive enough to think that love could not be cruel. I would sit on the porch and watch the neighborhood children skipping rope or chasing each other down the lane, their laughter rising like birdsong into the afternoon air. I remember wondering why their houses seemed full of sunlight while mine was always cast in shadow. The darkness crept in slowly at first, through words spoken in tones that no child should ever hear, through glances that twisted the role of father from protector into something dangerous. My father, the man who should have shielded me, became the source of my terror, and my mother, the woman whose embrace should have been my refuge, chose silence as her shield. I cannot tell you which was worse, the cruelty of his actions or the cold stillness of her eyes when she looked away. Even now, so many decades later, I can still hear the tick of that hallway clock marking the seconds of my childhood. I can smell the polish my mother rubbed into the wooden table, see the way the light bent through the kitchen window. These details live inside me because I studied them as a child, desperate to focus on anything but the reality closing in around me. I thought if I prayed enough, if I whispered the Hail Mary until my lips went dry, then perhaps God would send an angel to protect me. I stared at the stained glass windows of our parish chapel, the reds and blues spilling across the floor, and I asked why heaven had turned its face away. No answer ever came. Instead, silence became my only companion. I carried it to school, where my grades began to slip, though I had once been eager to learn. I carried it to the dinner table, where I learned to smile at the right moments so no one would ask questions. I carried it to bed each night, where I pushed furniture against my door as if wooden nails could keep nightmares away. But the silence never kept me safe. It only kept me hidden. I remember one evening in particular, the air heavy with the scent of rain that had not yet fallen. My father's footsteps echoed through the hallway, and with every step my heart pounded louder until I thought it would burst. My mother sat in the parlor chair, hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on the floor. She did not speak. She did not move. She simply let it happen. That night, I learned what true abandonment felt like. Not just from God, not just from the man who should have protected me, but from the mother whose silence pierced more deeply than any words. These moments left me broken long before I understood what it meant to collapse. I was still a child, but already I had aged in ways that cannot be measured by birthdays. I carried shame that was not mine, fear that grew heavier with each passing day, and a loneliness so complete it felt as though the world itself had turned its back on me. I tell you this now not because I enjoy revisiting those memories. They still taste of ashes in my mouth, but because you must understand the depth of the silence I carried. Without it, you cannot understand the miracle of survival. This is not simply a tale of cruelty. It is a testimony that even the most broken soul can be pieced back together. But before there was light, there was only darkness. Before there was healing, there was collapse. And before there was freedom, there was the long silence of a child who had no one to hear her cry. This is where my story begins, in the shadows of that ordinary home, in the silence that nearly destroyed me. Before the darkness came, there was once light. It feels important to tell you that, because for years I believed my whole childhood had been nothing but suffering. But memory is complicated. When I close my eyes, I can still find pieces of warmth, hidden in the corners, moments of laughter, small blessings that existed before everything fell apart. To understand the depth of my fall, you must first see the height from which I fell. I grew up in a modest house, a structure that smelled of wood polish and laundry soap. The floors creaked when anyone walked across them, and the narrow hallway carried sound as though it were a cathedral aisle. We did not have riches, but my parents often reminded me that we had what mattered: food on the table, clothes for school, and a roof to keep out the rain. It was the kind of home where neighbors nodded in approval, never suspecting what would one day take root behind its walls. My father was a stern man, respected in our parish. To the outside world, he was reliable, hard-working, a man who carried himself with authority. When he entered a room, silence often followed, not because of cruelty, but because people believed his word carried weight. As a little girl, I clung to that image. I wanted to believe my father's strength existed to protect me. I watched how the parish priest would shake his hand firmly after Mass, how shopkeepers gave him small discounts because they respected his work. At the time, I thought I was blessed to have such a father. My mother was quieter. She filled her days with chores, ironing until her fingers ached, scrubbing pots until they shone. She rarely raised her voice. Her silence was something I mistook for gentleness, the kind of stillness that meant she was patient and kind. She moved like a shadow through our home, keeping order, keeping everything in place. And when I was very young, I adored her for it. I thought her quiet meant peace. Only later would I realize it also meant surrender. Our days followed a rhythm. Each morning, I walked to school with my books tucked under my arm. I liked the cool air of dawn on my cheeks, the sound of sparrows in the hedges. The other children would laugh and chatter, but I often walked in silence, listening. My teachers praised me then. I was eager, always raising my hand with answers, always careful with my writing. At recess, I played jump rope or sat beneath the oak tree near the schoolyard fence, whispering prayers to saints whose faces I studied in holy cards. Sundays were special. We rose early, dressed in our best, and walked together to the church. I still remember the smell of incense thick in the air, the sound of the choir filling the vaulted ceiling with song. As a child, those moments felt holy and unshakable. I loved the way sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, spilling onto the pews in blues and reds, bathing us in colors that seemed almost heavenly. My small hands clutched the rosary my grandmother had once given me, and I whispered each bead with devotion, believing God heard me. There were small joys at home, too. I remember summer evenings when fireflies lit the yard, and I would chase them with a jar, laughing when their tiny lights blinked in the dusk. I remember winter nights when my mother baked bread, the warmth filling the kitchen while I sat near the stove, sketching pictures in a worn notebook. For a time, life seemed safe, ordinary, even gentle. And perhaps that is why the betrayal cut so deeply, because it came not in a world already cruel, but in one where I had believed myself loved. It is strange how the mind clings to details. I remember the pattern of the curtains in my bedroom, little blue flowers stitched into fabric. I remember the creak of the back gate when I swung it open to fetch water. These ordinary things, so harmless, became anchors in my memory when nothing else made sense. When fear came later, I would cling to these images like driftwood, reminders that once there had been innocence, once there had been joy. My childhood faith was strong then. I spoke to God as if He were sitting beside me. I would kneel by my bed and tell Him about my day, about the friends I had at school, about my secret wish to one day travel beyond our little town. I believed heaven was listening, and sometimes, in the hush of night, I even felt comforted, as though the saints leaned down from their stained glass windows to watch over me. I held on to that belief with the fierce devotion only a child can muster. But faith alone cannot shield a child from what is coming. I see that now. Innocence is fragile, and it breaks easily when the world decides to test it. The laughter of those summer evenings, the prayers whispered under church arches, the smell of fresh bread, all of it was swept away by the storm that followed. Still, I think it matters to say there was once goodness, because without it, my story would be only despair. It was the memory of those small joys that gave me strength when everything else was taken away. As I speak to you now, so many decades later, I still see that little girl in her school uniform walking with her books held tightly, her face lifted toward the sun, believing the world was safe. She did not know what waited just beyond the bend of her 13th year. She did not know that her prayers would soon turn from gratitude to desperate pleas for rescue. She did not know that her faith, once innocent, would be tested in the cruelest of ways. The story of my innocence ends where the story of my collapse begins. And though I wish I could leave that child forever in the safety of her laughter and her prayers, I cannot. Because the next chapter of my life tore through that safety, like a storm ripping through glass. And once shattered, nothing was ever the same. I wish I could say that my childhood innocence stretched on, that the laughter of fireflies and the warmth of my mother's bread carried me safely into my teenage years. But innocence is fragile, and mine was stolen far too soon. Looking back, I can see the signs of the storm before it broke, the way my father's eyes lingered too long, the way my mother's silence deepened into something colder. At the time, though, I did not understand. I was just a girl, standing at the threshold of womanhood, unprepared for what waited. The day it happened was unremarkable in every outward sense. The air was heavy with late summer heat. the kind that makes curtains stick to their windows and children drag their feet walking home from school. My mother left the house early that afternoon, carrying her basket of laundry to a client. She kissed my cheek, told me to mind the chores, and promised to return before evening. There was nothing unusual in her words, nothing to suggest she was leaving me defenseless. I was in the kitchen, standing at the sink with my hands submerged in soapy water, when I felt a presence behind me. My father. His footsteps had a weight. To them, always deliberate, but that day there was something different in the air. He stepped closer than he ever had before, his shadow stretching across the counter until it seemed to cover me completely. "You're growing up," he said softly, his voice coated in something that was neither paternal nor kind. A chill traveled through me. I tried to move aside, to busy myself with the dishes, but his hand clamped down on my arm. I froze, the plates slipping beneath the suds. In that moment, I realized something terrible, that the man I had once looked to as protector was no longer safe. My voice trembled as I whispered, "Papa, let me go." But he did not. The rest unfolded in a blur I cannot fully describe, and even now, decades later, I will not allow my tongue to form the details. What I can say is that the room that had once been filled with the smell of bread and the warmth of sunlight became a chamber of fear. My legs gave out beneath me. My voice cracked into silence. I felt the weight of betrayal pressing down until I thought I would break apart entirely. And then, when I could barely breathe, I lifted my eyes and saw her. My mother stood at the doorway, her hand resting on the frame. She did not cry out. She did not rush forward to pull me into her arms. She simply looked at me with eyes emptied of fight, and then she turned away. The silence of that moment struck, harder than my father's cruelty. To be hurt by him was one wound, but to be abandoned by her was another I still carry. When it was over, I collapsed onto the kitchen floor, my body trembling, my heart pounding against ribs that felt too fragile to contain it. My father left the room as though nothing had happened, his footsteps measured, his breath steady. I lay there staring at the ceiling, counting the cracks in the plaster, trying to convince myself it had not been real. But my skin burned, and my chest ached, and no amount of prayer could undo what had been done. That night, I pushed the dresser against my bedroom door, whispering every prayer I had ever learned. I begged God to erase me from existence, to carry me away in the night, to make me invisible. I thought of the saints, whose faces stared down from the holy cards tucked in my Bible, and wondered if they had once felt abandoned too. My mother passed by my door, her steps pausing for only a moment before moving on. She said nothing. She did nothing. And so my silence began. I returned to school the next day, the world moving as though nothing had changed, though everything had. My teacher asked me to read aloud from the blackboard, and my voice cracked. My classmates laughed, not knowing they were mocking the voice of someone already shattered. I wanted to tell someone, anyone, what had happened. But my father's words echoed inside me. "No one will believe you. They will say you wanted it." Shame curled around me like chains. From that day forward, the colors of childhood dulled. The stained glass windows at church no longer looked like heaven's light, but like shards of a broken promise. The fireflies in the yard no longer flickered with magic, but with warning. And every creak of the hallway floorboards at night sent me into panic. It was the first betrayal, but it was not the last. The silence that should have protected me instead became the weapon that allowed my father to return, again and again. And always, my mother watched. Sometimes she turned her face away, sometimes she pressed her lips into a thin line, but she never spoke. She never saved me. Her silence screamed louder than any cry. That was the night my childhood ended, not with a birthday candle blown out, not with a school certificate placed in my hands, but with a collapse on the kitchen floor and the knowledge that I had no protector. The girl who once whispered prayers with innocence became the girl who whispered them with desperation, clutching at heaven as though it were my only lifeline. I share this not to linger on the pain, but to tell you the truth, the beginning of I. My collapse was not the violence itself. It was the silence. The silence of a father's authority turned to cruelty, and the silence of a mother who chose not to speak. That silence would follow me for years. And in the chapters ahead, you will see how it became the cage I could not escape, the shadow that darkened every step, until the day my body itself gave way beneath the weight of it all. After that first betrayal, life no longer unfolded in days and nights. It unfolded in silences. The silence of my mother setting the table without meeting my eyes. The silence of my father passing me in the hallway with a glance that reminded me he held all the power. The silence of neighbors who smiled and waved, never guessing what was happening behind our closed doors. I learned quickly that silence was not simply the absence of words. It was a weapon. It was a prison. It was the chain that bound me tighter than any lock could. At school, my teachers began to notice the change. Once, I had been the eager girl with her hand raised, the one who earned gold stars on spelling tests and smiled shyly when praised. Now, my grades slipped, my notebooks filled with half-finished exercises. When asked to read aloud, my voice cracked, my face burned, and the words tangled in my throat. "Celeste," one teacher said gently, "you have always been diligent. What's happened to you?" I wanted so desperately to tell her. The words rose to my lips, trembling, begging to be released. But then I remembered my father's warning, "No one will believe you." And I remembered my mother's face in the doorway, her silence like a verdict. And so I lowered my eyes and whispered, "I'm just tired." That became my excuse for everything. I began to dress differently, even as a young girl. I wore baggy clothes, pulling sweaters over my frame even in the heat of summer. I stopped smiling, afraid that joy might be mistaken for invitation. I cut my hair shorter, tried to make myself invisible. If I could not disappear, at least I could blur the edges of myself. At home, the rhythm of life twisted into a cruel pattern. Every time my father's footsteps echoed toward me, I froze. Every time my mother picked up her basket and left for her errands, I felt the air shift. The house that had once been ordinary now became a place of shadows, where each creak of the floorboard, each closing door, filled me with dread. I moved through its rooms like a ghost, trying to vanish into corners, praying that if I stayed still enough, quiet enough, I would be spared. But silence did not protect me. It only deepened my isolation. My father grew bolder, certain I would never speak. My mother perfected her own silence, training herself not to look, not to hear, not to act. And I began to lose the will to fight. Nights were the hardest. I pushed furniture against my bedroom door, knelt by my bed, and whispered prayers until my lips went numb. Sometimes I cried out softly, begging heaven to hear me. "Please, God, send someone. Please don't leave me here." The stained glass windows, that had once filled me with wonder now seemed like cold shards of color. They showed saints and angels, but none of them descended to save me. There is a particular cruelty in believing that even God has turned away. I still clutched my rosary. I still whispered the prayers, but faith felt different now. It no longer tasted of hope. It tasted of desperation. I prayed not out of joy, but out of terror. My body began to reveal what my voice would not. I stopped eating properly, food turning to dust in my mouth. My face grew hollow. Dark circles shadowed my eyes. I fainted once at school, collapsing onto the tiled floor of the hallway, and when teachers rushed to my side, I told them it was the heat. It was easier to lie than to explain. Easier to stay silent than to risk disbelief. Rumors began to stir. In small towns, people notice when a girl changes. Some whispered that I was troubled, that I had become disobedient, maybe even sinful. I overheard my father fueling those lies, telling my mother that he had seen me talking too long with boys. Outside school, planting suspicion where there should have been trust. My mother looked at me with eyes clouded by doubt. "Is that true, Celeste? Are you leading yourself into trouble?" she asked. I shook my head, tears stinging, but she did not press further. She simply sighed and went back to her chores. Her silence built walls around me thicker than stone. I began to doubt myself. Was it my fault? Had I done something to invite this? The questions circled endlessly, feeding my guilt. That is the cruelest trick of silence. It makes the victim believe she deserves it. And yet, even in that darkness, some part of me still longed for rescue. When my father left on longer trips, when the house grew still without him, I felt a brief flicker of relief. I would imagine what it might be like to tell the truth, to hear my mother cry out in my defense, to see a door open and light pour in. But the moment he returned, that flicker died, smothered beneath fear. It is difficult to explain how silence reshapes a person. It presses down until you are no longer yourself. The girl who once chased fireflies became a shadow. The child who once dreamed of traveling far away could not imagine stepping beyond the gate. My life narrowed to a single point: survival. And yet, I survived. That was the one rebellion I had left. Each day I woke up and breathed. Each night I whispered my prayers. I told myself, I am still here. Silence may have been the weight I carried, but my heartbeat was my resistance. Still, the weight was crushing me. My body trembled with exhaustion, my spirit bent under shame, and though I did not know it then, the silence would eventually drive me to collapse. The body can only carry what the soul cannot for so long. Silence had become my armor, my cage, my prison. But even armor rusts, even cages bend beneath too much weight. By the time I entered my teenage years, my silence had seeped into every part of me. It lived in my bones, it whispered in my breath, it pulled me down until even standing felt like an act of rebellion. I had endured so much already, but the collapse was coming, as certain as the seasons. At first, it showed in small ways. My hands shook when I tried to write in my school books. The neat penmanship I had once taken pride in turned into scribbles that leaned sideways across the page. My teachers scolded me gently, urging me to take more care. I nodded, ashamed, but I could not explain that my hands trembled because they were never free of fear. Sleep began to abandon me. Each night I lay, awake listening for footsteps, straining to hear the creak of floorboards, the turning of a door handle. Even when the house was silent, my body did not believe it. My heart pounded in my chest as though trying to escape. When I finally drifted into sleep, nightmares dragged me back into memories I could not bear. I woke drenched in sweat. Sheets twisted around me like restraints. Food, too, lost its meaning. My mother placed bread and stew before me, but each bite turned to ash in my mouth. My body grew thinner, my face hollow, my eyes sunken. My classmates whispered behind my back, saying I looked like a ghost. In truth, I felt like one. The first time I fainted, I was kneeling in the chapel at school. The priest's words rose and fell above me, and suddenly the room swayed like a ship in a storm. My vision blurred, blackness pressing in from the corners, and then I was gone. When I woke, a circle of faces peered down at me, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and concern. A nun pressed a cool cloth to my forehead and told me I had to eat more, to rest more. I nodded mutely. No one guessed that rest was impossible in a house where dread waited behind every door. At home, my weakness became another weapon. My father sneered at my pallor, telling me I was ungrateful, lazy, broken. My mother offered no defense. I dragged myself through each day, my body betraying me just as my parents had. My silence had once been my choice, or so I thought. But now it seemed even my body was crying out, telling the world what my lips could not. One evening, after another day of faintness and fever, I stumbled into my room and collapsed against the bed. I remember the pattern of the curtains swaying gently in the warm night air, the tick of the hallway clock echoing like a drumbeat, and the ache in my chest so sharp I thought it would stop my heart. I whispered a prayer, not for strength, but for release. God, I said through trembling lips, either take me or save me. It was the most honest prayer I had ever spoken. The collapse did not happen all at once. It came in waves, each one stronger than the last. Some days I managed to drag myself to school, clinging to the hope that perhaps in the presence of others, I would feel safer. Other days I could not rise from bed, my body burning with fevers, my limbs heavy as lead. My mother brought me tea and placed the cup on my bedside table without speaking. She sat for a moment, her hands folded in her lap, but her eyes never met mine. I longed for her to reach for me, to hold me, to tell me I was not alone. Instead, she rose and left the room, her silence lingering like smoke. One night, I truly collapsed. I had tried to carry on with my chores, despite the dizziness clouding my head. I was sweeping the kitchen floor when the world tilted violently, and I crumpled onto the cold tiles. I remember the sting of the floor against my cheek, the taste of dust in my mouth, and the way my breath came in shallow gasps. I thought then that it might be the end, that I would die right there, unseen, unheard, abandoned in the same silence. I had always known, but I did not die. I woke to the sound of voices, muffled and sharp, my mother's rising in alarm for the first time I could remember. My father's footsteps pounded down the hallway, heavy and impatient. The world swirled around me as I drifted in and out of consciousness, my body betraying me, my secret nearly spilling into the open. For the first time, others could see the cost of my silence carved into my frail frame. And yet, even then, I said nothing. When they asked me what had happened, I whispered only, "I'm tired, just tired." The lie slipped from my lips easily, but it cut me deeply. I realized I had become so accustomed to hiding the truth that even as my body cried out, I still smothered the words. But the collapse had set something in motion. My weakness was no longer invisible. Teachers whispered about me. A nun at school began watching me more closely. My body, though fragile, had done what my voice could not. It had betrayed the silence. I did not know it then, but the cracks had begun to show. And through those cracks, the truth would soon seep out, no matter how tightly I tried to hold it in. When I look back, I realize my body had been trying to speak long before my voice ever dared. Every fainting spell, every fever, every tremor of my hands was a cry for help. But in the house where I lived, no one listened. It took collapsing, in front of others, away from my father's watchful eyes and my mother's silence, for someone to finally notice what I had been trying so desperately to hide. The morning of my discovery began like so many others. I felt weak before I even rose from bed, my limbs heavy, my breath shallow. But I forced myself to go to school, clutching my books to my chest as though they were shields. I told myself that if I could just make it through the day, if I could just endure a little longer, perhaps no one would see how close I was to breaking. In class, the letters on the blackboard swam before my eyes. My teacher's voice echoed as though from a great distance. I tried to steady my breathing, but the world tilted violently. Before I knew it, the floor rushed up to meet me. When I opened my eyes, I was lying on the ground, surrounded by startled faces. The children whispered, some concerned, some curious. But it was a nun, a kind woman who taught catechism, who knelt beside me. Her hand rested gently on my shoulder, and she whispered, "Celeste, you're safe. Stay with us." That was the first time in years anyone had spoken the word safe to me. I was carried to the infirmary, my body trembling. The school nurse pressed a hand to my forehead and frowned. "This child is far too thin," she said, almost to herself. "And these bruises, what's happening at home?" The question hung in the air like smoke. My lips parted, the truth rising within me like a flood, but fear clamped down. I shook my head, whispering, "I just fall sometimes." They sent me to the hospital that afternoon. I remember the sharp smell of antiseptic, the crisp sheets against my skin, the hum of fluorescent lights above me. Doctors murmured in low voices outside the curtain. I caught fragments. Malnourished, repeated trauma. Not accidental. The words made my heart pound, but a strange part of me also felt relief. At last, someone was naming what I could not. A social worker came to see me. She was a woman with gentle eyes who sat at my bedside and asked soft questions. "Celeste, do you feel safe at home? Has anyone hurt you?" The truth burned on my tongue, begging to be spoken. I wanted to tell her everything, to pour out the years of silence, the nights of terror, the betrayal of my mother's stillness. But fear still held me captive. I heard my father's voice in my mind. "No one will believe you. They'll say it's your fault." And so I shook my head. "I'm just clumsy," I whispered. "But the body does not lie. My frailty, my hollow frame, the marks left upon me, they spoke louder than my words." The doctors looked at one another with suspicion. The nun who had carried me to safety stayed by my side, her rosary clutched in her hands, her lips moving in prayer. I could feel her gaze upon me, searching, patient, as though she knew there was more beneath my silence. When my father arrived at the hospital, the air changed instantly. His presence filled the room like smoke, suffocating and heavy. He demanded explanations in a voice that brooked no opposition. My daughter is delicate, he told the doctors. She faints. She's always been frail. There's nothing wrong in our home. His words were smooth, practiced, the kind of lies he had told for years. I curled into myself, trembling. My father's eyes locked onto mine, and in them I saw the warning, "Say nothing." My mother stood beside him, her face pale, her lips pressed tightly together. She did not speak. She never did. The doctors exchanged looks, but said nothing more in front of him. When he left to speak with them privately, the nun bent close to me and whispered, "Child, you do not have to be afraid anymore. God sees you. I see you." Her words cracked something inside me. For the first time, I felt the faint possibility that someone might believe me. Still, I could not yet speak the full truth. The fear was too deeply carved into me, the silence too heavy. But seeds had been planted. The doctors had seen the marks, the nun had seen the collapse, the social worker had heard my trembling denials. The web of silence was beginning to fray. I left the hospital after several days, my father's arm gripping mine tightly as though to remind me that I still belonged to his shadow. My mother walked slightly behind, her footsteps hesitant, her silence now almost unbearable. I returned to the house that had become my prison, but something had shifted. The world beyond those walls had glimpsed the truth, and I could not forget that. At night, when I knelt to pray, my words were different. I no longer begged only for escape. I began to pray for courage, for the strength to let someone in, for the day when silence would no longer be my only companion. I did not know it then, but my collapse had opened the first crack in the walls around me, and through that crack, light was beginning to seep. When I returned from the hospital, nothing in my home looked different, yet everything had changed. The walls still carried the same wallpaper, the hallway clock still ticked its measured rhythm, and the curtains still fluttered in the summer breeze. But beneath that thin layer of ordinary, the house trembled with tension. My collapse had stirred something no one could ignore, and though my father tried to tighten his grip, cracks had begun to form. My father's temper grew sharper, his words cutting like knives. He scolded me for walking too slowly, for leaving crumbs on the table, for existing in a way that displeased him. But behind his rage, I sensed fear, not of me, but of discovery. He had ruled our house with silence for so long that the thought of others peering into our world unsettled him. His eyes followed me constantly, reminding me of the unspoken command, "Say nothing." My mother, on the other hand, seemed to retreat even further into her silence. She moved through the house like a shadow, her lips pressed tightly together, her hands busy with endless chores. Sometimes I caught her staring at me, her eyes full of something I could not name, guilt, perhaps, or sorrow. But when I looked back, she quickly turned away. Her silence screamed louder than words ever could. Meals became unbearable. We sat at the table, the three of us, with only the clinking of silverware to fill the air. My father's gaze was heavy, my mother's downcast, and I, trapped between them, forced myself to chew food that felt like stones in my mouth. The house was no longer a home. It was a stage where we played out a performance of normality for the world beyond our walls. But the truth has a way of seeping out, even through the smallest cracks. Teachers continued to ask questions about my health. The nun who had carried me to safety at the hospital checked on me often, her eyes lingering as if waiting for me to say the words I could not yet speak. And within me, something began to shift. I had lived so long under silence that even the smallest hint of belief, of compassion, began to feel like a lifeline. One evening, the tension erupted. I heard my parents arguing behind their closed bedroom door, their voices sharp and urgent. My mother's tone was higher than I had ever heard it, trembling with fear. My father barked back, his anger filling the air like thunder. I pressed, my ear to the wall, straining to catch their words. "She's weak," my father growled. "If people start asking questions—" "They already are," my mother whispered, her voice breaking. "You cannot keep this hidden forever." My breath caught. For the first time, I heard my mother acknowledge the truth aloud. It was not a defense, not a rescue, but it was recognition. The silence was cracking. After that night, my father's watchfulness grew even more suffocating. He followed my movements with suspicion, as though expecting me to betray him at any moment. My mother avoided me, her footsteps quickening whenever I entered a room. The weight of their fear pressed against me, but strangely, it also gave me strength. If they were afraid of the truth, then perhaps the truth had power. The breaking point came on a rainy afternoon. I had been kept home from school, my body too weak to rise. The house was dim, the windows streaked with water, the sound of rain, a constant murmur. My father left for work, his footsteps echoing as the door slammed shut. My mother moved quietly through the house, humming softly as she folded laundry. It was then that the nun from school appeared. She had come to check on me, carrying a basket of bread and soup. She sat beside my bed, her eyes searching my face. "Celeste," she said gently, "I know something is wrong. You do not have to tell me everything, but please, let me help." "You!" I stared at her, my throat tight, my hands trembling in my lap. For years I had swallowed every word, buried every scream. But her voice, her eyes, her patience broke through the walls I had built. And before I could stop myself, the truth slipped out in a whisper so faint I wondered if she had heard it. "It was my father," I said. The words hung in the air like thunder. My chest heaved, my eyes filled with tears, and for the first time in years, I let myself cry in front of another. The nun's arms wrapped around me, firm and steady, and she whispered prayers into my hair. She did not recoil, she did not question. She believed me. And that belief was enough to pierce the silence that had bound me for so long. In that moment, I felt both terror and relief. Terror, because I knew the storm this confession would bring. Relief because at last, someone else carried a piece of my burden. The shattered house I lived in could no longer contain the truth. I did not know then how swiftly everything would unravel, the confrontation, the police, the bitter tears. But I knew this. My silence had finally broken, and once broken, it could never fully return. The moment the words left my lips, it was my father. The world I had known began to unravel. For years, silence had been my prison, but it had also been the thin fabric holding my fragile reality together. Once I tore through that fabric, there was no stitching it back. Rescue was coming, but so was ruin, and the line between them blurred in ways I could not have imagined. The nun who held me that day wasted no time. She left my side only long enough to speak with others at the parish, and soon whispers reached ears beyond our home. A social worker returned, firmer this time, her questions pointed, her notebook open on her lap. My answers were still halting, my voice trembling, but I no longer denied the truth. Each admission felt like tearing open a wound, yet with each tear came the faintest breath of air. When the police arrived, their presence filled our small home with a weight heavier than any silence had before. My father bristled with indignation, his voice booming as he demanded to know why they had come. "My family is private," he barked. "We need no interference." But the officers were unmoved. They asked questions he could not dismiss with charm or authority. I sat at the edge of the sofa, my knees pressed together, my hands clenched in my lap. My heart pounded so loudly I thought everyone in the room could hear it. My father's eyes cut into me, sharp with warning. My mother sat rigid in her chair, her face pale, her lips trembling, but still sealed. "Celeste," one officer said gently, "we're here to protect you. You don't have to be afraid anymore. Just tell us the truth." I opened my mouth, but the words stuck. My father's glare burned into me. I could not speak. The silence stretched unbearably until the nun stepped forward. "She has already told me," she said firmly. She spoke the truth. Her voice carried a certainty I could not summon for myself. My father exploded then. He shouted denials, his hands clenched into fists, his face red with rage. He turned on my mother, demanding she defend him, but she only shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I can't," she whispered. It was the first time she had chosen words over silence, yet they came too late. The officers moved swiftly. They restrained my father, his shouts echoing through the house as though the walls themselves would collapse. My mother sobbed quietly, her body shaking. And I, frozen, trembling, watched as the man who had ruled my life with cruelty and fear was finally dragged away in handcuffs. You might think I felt relief in that moment, but the truth is more complicated. Relief and terror twisted together inside me. What would happen now? Where would I go? Who was I, without the silence that had defined me for so long? The days that followed blurred together. Investigators asked endless questions, their pens scratching across paper as they recorded every fragment of my story. Doctors examined me with solemn faces, their notes confirming the pain my words could not fully capture. The nun stayed near, offering comfort, whispering prayers, reminding me that I was not alone. But rescue did not feel like triumph. It felt like ruin. The family I had once believed unshakable was in pieces. My father sat in a cell. My mother, though free to speak at last, chose mostly to weep, her guilt crushing her as surely as silence once had. I was placed into protective care, my belongings hastily packed into a small bag. I remember sitting in the back seat of a car as rain streaked the windows, watching my house shrink in the distance. Though it had been a place of torment, it was also the only home I had ever known. Leaving it behind felt like losing the last remnants of who I had been. In my new surroundings, kindness met me, but I struggled to receive it. Social workers offered gentle smiles, teachers tried to encourage me, but I recoiled, unaccustomed to trust. Nights were the hardest. I would lie awake, listening to the quiet, half expecting to hear the familiar creak of floorboards, the heavy tread of footsteps. Even when safe, fear clung to me. And yet, beneath the fear, a seed had been planted. The memory of the nun's voice declaring, "She spoke the truth," echoed in my heart. For the first time, someone had stood with me, unflinching. That truth, though terrifying, was also freeing. Rescue and ruin had come hand in hand, but from their collision, something new was beginning, the possibility of life beyond silence. Did not yet feel strong. I did not yet feel healed, but I was no longer hidden, And sometimes being seen, even in pain, is the first step toward being whole. Healing is not a single moment. It is not the day my father was taken away, nor the day I left that house with my belongings in a small bag. Healing, I learned, is a path, uneven, winding, and often painful. Rescue had freed me from the hands that hurt me, but it did not erase the scars inside. They remained etched into my mind, my heart, my very bones. In the weeks after my father's arrest, I felt like a ghost wandering through borrowed spaces. I was placed in protective care with distant relatives for a time, then in a home supervised by women who tried their best to be kind. They offered warm meals, clean clothes, and words of comfort. Yet every kindness felt strange, unfamiliar, as if it were a language I did not know how to speak. Trust had been stolen from me, and it would take years to learn it again. Therapy came first. A woman with soft eyes and a notebook sat across from me, asking gentle questions. "How are you feeling today, Celeste?" she would ask. Most days, I stared at the floor, unsure how to answer. My feelings were too tangled to name: fear, guilt, sorrow, anger, shame. Sometimes I said nothing at all. Other times I whispered fragments, small pieces of the story that had once been too dangerous to tell. Each word I released felt like stepping into the open air, both terrifying and liberating. The nun who had first believed me continued to visit. She brought books, rosaries, and sometimes simply her presence. She never pushed, never demanded. She sat with me in silence when I had no words. Through her, I began to glimpse the possibility that not every silence was cruel. Some silences were gentle, holding space for truth to surface. As months turned into years, I grew stronger. My body regained weight, my hands steadied, my eyes lifted more often to meet the world. I discovered small joys again, reading by lamplight, walking in gardens where flowers bloomed without fear, hearing laughter that did not carry malice. Slowly, I began to believe that life could be more than survival. Faith, too, returned in a new form. As a child, I had prayed with innocence. In my suffering, I had prayed with desperation. But now, my prayers became conversations, sometimes questioning, sometimes grateful, sometimes simply quiet. I no longer imagined a God who had turned away, but one who had wept with me, who had sent people into my life to keep me from vanishing. The chapel became my refuge again, not as a place of unanswered cries, but as a place where I could rest my weary spirit. It was in those chapels, sitting beneath stained glass windows, that the idea of a vocation first stirred within me. At first, it seemed impossible. How could someone so broken give her life to God? But the more I prayed, the more I realized it was precisely because of my wounds that I felt called. I knew what it was to suffer in silence. I knew what it was to long for someone to listen, to believe, to stay. I wanted to become that presence, for others, the way the nun had once been for me. The path was not easy. Even as I studied and prepared for convent life, the past haunted me. Some nights I woke in tears, memories pressing against me like ghosts. There were days when shame whispered that I was unworthy to wear the habit. But I learned to meet those whispers with truth. I had survived. I had endured, and survival itself was proof of strength. When the day finally came for me to take my vows, I stood before the altar trembling, not with fear, but with awe. I spoke the words of devotion, promising my life to service, to compassion, to God. As I knelt, the choir sang, and I felt a peace I had never known before. My wounds did not vanish, but they no longer defined me. They had become part of the story I now carried into the world. As Sister Celeste Warren, I began to live not as a victim, but as a witness. I taught children, knowing how much one word of kindness could mean. I visited the sick, holding their hands through silence that was not abandonment, but companionship. I listened to the broken-hearted, reminding them that their pain did not make them unworthy of love. Healing is never complete. Even now, as an old woman, I still feel the ache of what was taken from me. But healing is not about erasing the past. It is about reclaiming life in spite of it. Each prayer I whispered, each vow I made, each step I took into the service of others was part of that reclamation. I was no longer the girl who collapsed under silence. I was no longer the child who begged for escape. I had become a woman who turned suffering into testimony, who found strength in the very places where she had once been broken. And though the path was long and often steep, it led me here, to a life not of despair, but of meaning. As I sit here now, decades removed from the house where my childhood was lost, I find myself returning often to the sound of silence. It is still with me, the silence of empty rooms, the silence of unanswered prayers, the silence of a mother who turned away. But silence no longer binds me. Today it serves as a reminder of how far I have come. I am Sister Celeste Warren. I have lived many years in this habit, walked countless hallways of convents and schools, prayed in chapels where candle flames flicker against stone walls. To those who know me today, I am a teacher, a comforter, a woman who listens more than she speaks. Many believe I was always this way, steady and serene. They do not see the shadowed child behind the nun, the girl who once collapsed beneath secrets too heavy to carry. I choose to tell you now, because my life is nearing its close, and I do not wish my silence to outlive me. There is no peace in hiding what happened, no honor in pretending my wounds never existed. The peace I have found is in truth. It was truth that set me free when I whispered it for the first time to a nun who believed me. It was truth that allowed me to heal, to transform, to step into the life I have lived since. And it is truth that I hope will give light to someone else who is still trapped in silence. There are days when memories return with sharpness, uninvited. I see the hallway of my childhood home, the cracked plaster ceiling, the kitchen tiles, where I once collapsed. I hear my father's voice. I see my mother's still eyes. These moments still have power, but they do not control me. When they rise, I breathe deeply, I pray, and I remind myself, I am no longer that child. I am no longer captive. Over the years, I have met many souls who carry burdens hidden behind their smiles. They sit across from me, sometimes in classrooms, sometimes in confessional whispers, sometimes in hospital beds. I have seen the same haunted look I once carried, the same fear of not being believed. To them, I have said the words I once longed to hear. I believe you. You are not alone. Each time I speak those words, I feel the circle complete itself, the compassion I was once given becoming the compassion I can now offer. There is a tendency to imagine survival as a triumphant victory, as though scars transform into medals of honor. But survival is quieter than that. It is waking up each day and choosing to breathe. It is carrying wounds that never fully vanish, but no longer dictate the path ahead. It is learning to live with tenderness after years of cruelty. My survival was not loud or glorious. It was steady, humble, one step at a time. I often think of my mother. For years, I could not say her name without bitterness. Her silence had felt like betrayal, as sharp as my father's cruelty. But as time passed, I came to see her more clearly, not as an excuse, never as justification, but as a human being trapped in her own prison of fear. She chose silence, and that choice harmed me deeply. Yet I pray for her soul, and in my heart, I have learned to forgive. Forgiveness does not erase the past, but it releases me from carrying her silence as my own, and my father, his memory, will never bring peace. He took from me what he had no right to touch. He twisted the role of protector into that of destroyer. But he does not own my story anymore. For years, I thought he defined me. Now I know he was only the beginning of my testimony, not the end. Winnie. I walk through the convent gardens. I look at the roses blooming against the old brick walls. Their petals are soft, their thorns sharp, yet both belong to the same stem. That is how I see my life. Beauty and pain entwined, impossible to separate, yet together forming something whole. I am an old woman now, and I know my days are fewer than they once were. But I am not afraid. The silence that once crushed me has been broken. My voice, once trapped in whispers, now speaks freely. And I share it so that others will know. You can survive what seems unsurvivable. You can walk through ruin and still find purpose. You can be shattered and still be made whole. If you are listening to me, if you carry a secret that weighs like stone in your chest, hear me now. You are not alone. Speak when you are ready, whisper if you must, but know that your silence is not your destiny. Truth may be painful, but it is also the first breath of freedom. My story began with collapse, but it does not end there. It ends here with testimony. It ends here with survival. And it ends here with hope.